in defense, and it has really flowered in the last couple of years, particularly with the, as Mr. Nishi said, the development of the North Korean nuclear and missile programs, as well as the rise of China. And I actually think that despite all the uncertainties associated with the new administration, the Trump administration, U.S.-Japan defense ties are probably stronger than they have ever been. And I'll stop there on bilateral relations and I guess turn it over to Ambassador Armacost.
Well, let me introduce Ambassador Armacost first then.
I should apologize first for being here so late.
No,
we were within 2 blocks of here for an hour.
Actually, Ambassador Armacost needs no introduction because I think everyone in the room already knows him. Ambassador Armacost was our U.S. ambassador to Japan in the late 80s. He has held a number of senior posts. He was a fellow Foreign Service officer and one of the very few career officers to become a U.S. ambassador to Japan. He was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He was our ambassador to the Philippines during a very important and difficult time in that relationship. So vast experience, and is today, as you all know, a fellow at Stanford at the APARC Center. So without further ado, Ambassador Armacost. I'm sorry, the most important thing for me, not for him, is that he was my boss in Japan.
Wow. Well, I'm sorry to be late. We were within a couple of blocks, but somehow the proper room eluded us. In any way, I don't want to rehash what others have said, so let me just make a few brief comments, mainly about Trump. I don't know whether you've touched on that or not. It's hard to assess the Trump administration's attitude toward the alliance or role on the basis of just a relatively short time. He came to office, of course, without experience either in politics or in foreign policy. His approach seems to be quite impulsive and quite transactional. During his campaign, he was generally dismissive, it seemed to me, about America's Asian alliances. He often described our partners as freeloaders or free riders, seemed mainly interested in prodding them into paying a larger share of the security bill. Subsequently, I think someone must have informed him about the concept of host nation support and the large supply of such assistance from Asian allies, particularly Japan, because the criticism of Japan then rather sharply declined. Within days of his inauguration, he withdrew, as you all know, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, promising a free trade arrangement. This evidently reflected the scorn he expressed during the campaign for multilateral arrangements, but the practical effects, I think, are not yet clear, at least to me. I tend to believe it's better to be inside these kinds of arrangements looking out rather than outside looking in. But that verdict is not yet final. China is clearly a central player in the region, and thus far it's difficult to discern a very clear, consistent Trump approach to Beijing, other than the tendency so far, not unusual for new administrations, to kick problems down the road, major problems. He worries and worries aloud about North Korea, would doubtless love to offload that problem to the Chinese. The Chinese won't play that game, so I expect we'll continue to see a lot of improvisation and a lot of uncertainty. More generally, President Trump's policy toward the region has been, as I said, transactional rather than conceptual. He obviously prefers to work through bilateral channels. He relies very heavily on his own instincts. He remains remarkably understaffed, particularly in the State Department, where very few political appointees have even been nominated, let alone confirmed. So what can one say about how the U.S.-Japan alliance has been doing thus far during the Trump administration? It seemed to me after a somewhat patchy start, we're doing okay. Needless to add, the Abe administration deserves a lot of the credit for that. The trajectory of their defense budget is up. They've dropped the previous ban on exporting arms to others. They've shifted China policy from a kind of soft diplomatic balancing to a harder balancing that includes military power. They've amended many of the restrictions that used to affect defense cooperation with the U.S. I would conclude by noting that Mr. Abe, I think, is not inclined to spend a lot of time apologizing for Japan's past deeds. I think that's a correct posture. In his view, there's been enough of that. Instead, he's encouraging patriotism at home and promoting allies or values like market-oriented democracy and the rule of law. These not only provide a strong contrast with the Chinese views, but an ideological basis for affirming not only the alliance with us, but what seems to me as a promising concept of a quad that would embrace not just the U.S. and Japan, but Australia and India as well. It's a grouping that I think deserves a lot more attention and support in the years to come. Let me stop there and be guided by your questions and avoid repeating what others have said.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And David, you had mentioned that in a sense, the stance of U.S. defense policy folks for many years had been an effort to try to stretch the cooperation, to have more cooperation, and through the revisions of the guidelines that occurred. Now we have a situation in which Japan seems to be the one ready to move faster than America. Is that do you think that's overstating it? And are we seeing is it possible we could be seeing a different kind of relationship in terms of the partnership between U.S. and Japan, in which Japan is playing a more robust role? Actually, let me ask all three speakers to address that question.
I think Japan is trying to stretch the envelope in terms, very much trying to stretch the envelope, particularly in terms of the domestic political consensus surrounding Japan's role in the region and Japan's defense activities. And Prime Minister Abe has been particularly strong activist in this regard. In 2014 or 2015, he passed through the Diet a pretty big change in the way Japan views and operates with regard to collective self-defense. And that has a very strong effect on the way in which U.S. and Japanese forces can cooperate on the water and in the air and on the ground as well. So Prime Minister Abe has been particularly forcible and forward-leaning in his approach to Japan's defense policy on its own, unilaterally, as well as what it should be doing with the United States. And we're seeing that in terms of the extent to which we plan together militarily, the extent to which we train and operate together as well. And we're operating together in places we've never operated together before, not just in the East China Sea, but in the South China Sea as well as in the Indian Ocean, multilaterally with the Indians as well. And this is something that was hard to think of just 10 years ago. So we've seen a very, very fast and very broad evolution in the ways in which we can cooperate, partly because Prime Minister Abe has been so forward-leaning.
Prime Minister Abe himself have two faces. One in domestic terms. It's often misunderstood, but his past initiatives, last few years, is very liberal type of initiatives. Therefore, he got better support than ever when he was assigned to the Prime Minister in his second time. At the same time, he is well known as his conservative position. Therefore, he can easily persuade the right-wing people and the LDP, the governing party side, that even I endure this situation, so why not you? And so, therefore, the Prime Minister Abe's initiative is quite wide and stretching not only the conservative side, but also the liberal side. And that actually brought the DPJ, the opposition parties, into a very difficult corner of the political flexibility. And finally, now he is facing the difficult task of the amendment of the Constitution itself. He hasn't made his position clear, or not say, doesn't show his whole view of the of his idea of the revised of the Constitution. But since the New Year's Day, what I found important is that he made it quite clear that the exclusive defense-oriented policy that has been the principle for the Japanese defense policy since the end of the Second World War. But that costs a lot. That what Prime Minister made it quite clear, because Japan is not going to take first strike approaches. In other words, we are going to react once we are offended. That cost, in other words, we have to survive the first strike from our enemies. Of course, we are going to pay a lot of attention to wipe that first strike, but still not perfect. So what he made quite clear is that the Japanese traditional defense policy is not an easy one. He made it quite clear to the public announcement, public speeches. So in the coming debate season of the Diet, that is going to start from late January. But I am sure there will be a very important debate related to the security policies in general. And this is going to give us the good understanding that how far he'd like to go forward for the defense cooperation with the United States. Also, the important thing is how far we are going to intensify our defense security dialogues with ASEAN 10. We've done vice minister level security talks with ASEAN 10 past 10 years, but gradually we find the division of ASEAN 10, in other words, pro-China and not pro-China, these divisions are getting more and more serious. How far the Japan position is going to be, we don't want to say the ASEAN is going to be divided, but how and in what manner we can keep and encourage ASEAN's unity for the favor of the Japan. That is going to be an important topic for Japan and also for the US and Australia. In my last term of the Defense Vice Minister, we proposed to the US and Australia that we have to work out the joint plan of the security build-up assistance to ASEAN 10 as a good cooperation of these trilaterals. And I'm sure this kind of multilateral approaches amongst allies is going to be very important for the further stabilization of the region. And I think Japan is eager to take better initiatives to promote this kind of cooperation amongst us. I think this is my presentation.
Well, I agree with everything I've heard Mr. Nishi say. And it seemed to me from an American standpoint, the initiatives that Prime Minister Abe is taking are very welcome and very timely. It's healthy, I think, to see the Japan defense budget rising, albeit gradually. I think the National Defense Program guidelines make a lot of sense. They allow for a more balanced defense posture. I think the military equipment is being modernized in a very helpful way, and generally in a way that's compatible with the equipment in the United States. It's acquiring more powerful submarines, destroyers, carriers, and that naval cooperation is especially critical to us. They can now project their military power outward with greater readiness and greater flexibility, greater versatility, greater sustainability. All those things I think are welcome, certainly in Washington. Defense cooperation with the U.S. is up in an impressive way. I regard Prime Minister Abe as someone who's worked very closely with us in expanding intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities.